Nina Khrushcheva, against the motion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rosenkranz Foundation. Thank you, the opposers of the motion, and thank you, those who vote for it, and thank you, Edward Lucas. There are at least three reasons as to why Russia is not becoming an enemy, or at least shouldn't become one. One, today the world is no longer bipolar. In fact, it's not even multipolar, even unipolar, even if some in the United States may still think it is. That is, America is no longer in a position to decide who to make or not to make an enemy, even though it certainly continues to be listened to in this regard. But there are many more actors in play today, China, Middle East, Europe, whose international interests have to be considered. There is no Cold War ideological divide in which one ideology wants to take over the other and dominate the world. Thus, at present, there are no geopolitical conditions for the Cold War. Two, despite the 11 time zones, Russia is not a Soviet empire to fight against. It's not an empire at all. Although true, under Vladimir Putin, it appears Russia still has its imperial ambitions, as those who supported the motion very ably demonstrated. However, the country today doesn't have its former capabilities. It could, with varying successes, sometimes create an illusion of those capabilities, such as testing weapons or reinstating military exercises, which actually have been very much prone to accidents. Although at times Putin tries to flex his imperial muscles, old habits die hard, obviously, such as during the 2004 presidential Ukrainian elections, he's more interested in being recognized as an international player than really building an empire. But if he feels, in order to be recognized as a player, he needs to play an empire, he would, and he does. Three, the United States grumble about Putin's international policy, but loudly talks about his internal policy. But actually, disagreements on how to run a state is not enough to make an enemy. Just look at Saudi Arabia. While in foreign policy, the discussion actually does take place. Here I would like to quote quite commonsensical Condoleezza Rice during the talks on the US missile defense plan in Eastern Europe. And I quote, "Even though we have our differences, we have a great deal in common because that which unites us in trying to deal with threats of terrorism, of proliferation, is much greater than the issues that divide us." She said it in Moscow on October 12th this year. Moreover, even Dick Cheney, who came out of the Dr. Strangelove Cold War generation and thus sees enemies everywhere, in 2006 Vilnius presentation, despite his tough talk on Putin's backtracking on democracy, said, and I quote, "None of us believes that Russia is fated to become an enemy." So it's not just George Bush. There are smarter people who said that. Let me develop on all 3 points. 2-1, on no ideological divide. In fact, Putin would argue that both Russia and the United States today are of the same ideology, that is democracy, and of the same economic system, which is capitalism. In essence, he feels they disagree on tactics, methodology, and implementation. The unifying context of his presidency is that Russia will be great and strong if it continues to be a multi-party democracy. But despite the wishes of the West, it can exist without a strong leader, president, prime minister, or whoever he chooses to continue to be. In Russia, the economy is free, he says, but the state must control its wealth. Therefore, Putin so bristles at suggestions that he is backtracking on democracy. At the Valdai Discussion Club meeting in Sochi this September, Putin criticized the United States' criticism as a ploy. And I quote, "We see efforts to exploit the phraseology of democracy to influence over internal politics. This is dangerous. It undermines faith in the basic principles of democracy. If you need something from us, you need to talk about the substance, not to approach it from another angle. You need to resolve Kosovo, talk about Kosovo. You need to resolve the nuclear issue from Iran, talk about Iran, not about democracy in Russia." To number 2, unthreatening so far Russian imperial ambition. Putin's message that Russia is a great, powerful, and divinely ordained state that stretches back 1,000 years, and the fact that he's there to restore its glory and its proper place in the world is very much embraced by the Russians, as Mr. Rosenkranz indicated. At times, it may sound like boastful animosity, but this tough imperial-sounding stance is only a logical consequence of the brutal disappointment of the Russians with the course of events since the collapse of communism. Poverty, political wars, crony privatization, the 1998 financial crisis, along with the humiliations, perceived and real, inflicted by the West, from the NATO expansion to endless preaching. As Russians see it, it is Putin's no-nonsense rhetoric and his firm actions, both at home and abroad, that allows him, in just a dozen years, to lead the country from bankruptcy and despair to wealth and power, which in Russia historically thought of in imperial terms. To number 3, to common interests. Putin is prepared to cooperate with the state, even if he promptly switches to confrontation when he senses a snub, like that Cheney talk in Vilnius. However, the Russian presidents and the US vice presidents bickering is not about the future Cold War, I think, but rather means the following, and these are my words, not theirs. We're annoyed at each other for either country putting itself first, obviously none lost superpower ambitions, for not being what the other wants it to be, but this is rather a political game than a war, an enemy public holder, while we deal with much more pressing issues that really preoccupy us: terrorism, nuclear threats, energy security, and many, many more. In conclusion, US-Russian relations today certainly display annoyance and some genetic Cold War-rooted suspicions. So the language of the Cold War creeps in and is read as animosity. But there is a serious recognition that there is plenty of common interest in the oil and energy strategy, talks with Iran and North Korea, and many others. Let's face it, we all need a good enemy. And while bin Laden is at large and terrorism is too amorphous and the fight with it is not going too well, Russia and the United States need their Cold War dance moves to pass time before they figure out what their relationship really is or should be when next year, the next administration, at least in America, comes in. Thank you.